The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the construction site, but I couldn't feel its warmth anymore. Not since the accident 3 weeks ago. I sat in my beat-up 2012 Ford pickup truck outside the unemployment office, staring at the rejection letter in my hands. Disability claim denied pending further review. The words blurred together as sweat dripped onto the paper. My name is Marcus Thompson, and at 34, I thought I had life figured out. 20 years in construction, steady paycheck, small apartment in a decent part of Phoenix. Then one slip on wet concrete changed everything. My back injury wasn't just physical, it was financial suicide. I pulled out my phone and checked my bank account. $347. Rent was due in 5 days. $200. The math was simple and brutal. Come on, Marcus. Think, I muttered to myself, wiping sweat from my forehead. The desert heat was nothing compared to the burning anxiety in my chest. That's when I remembered my neighbor, Eddie Ramirez. He was always talking about these storage unit auctions, how people made quick cash buying abandoned units and reselling the contents. I'd always thought it was just gambling, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I drove to Eddie's apartment a few blocks from mine. He was working on his motorcycle in the parking lot, grease covering his weathered hands. "Marcus, how's the back, hermano?" Eddie looked up, genuine concern in his eyes. "Not great, Eddie. Listen, you mentioned those storage auctions before. How does it actually work?" Eddie set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. "You serious? It's not as easy as TV makes it look, you know. You bid on units sight unseen, just what you can see from the doorway. Most of the time it's junk, pure junk. But sometimes, Eddie's eyes lit up. Sometimes you find gold. Literally. I once bought a unit for $50, found a wedding ring set worth $800. But Marcus, for every success story, there are 10 people who lose their shirts." I explained my situation, the injury, the denied claim, the looming rent. Eddie listened, nodding slowly. "There's an auction tomorrow morning. Sunrise Storage on McDowell Road. But Marcus, don't spend money you can't afford to lose." That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my back throbbing with each heartbeat. The fan overhead creaked rhythmically, a soundtrack to my anxiety. I had $347 to my name. If I spent $200 on auction bids and came up empty, I'd be homeless within a week. But if I did nothing, I'd be homeless anyway. The next morning I drove through Phoenix as the city was waking up. The storage facility was in an older part of town where strip malls and auto repair shops lined the streets. About 30 people had gathered for the auction, a mix of seasoned dealers with moving trucks and desperate-looking individuals like myself. The auctioneer, a loud man named Bill with a cowboy hat and a booming voice, explained the rules. You bid, you buy, you clean it out within 48 hours. Cash only. No returns, no refunds, no crying. The crowd laughed nervously. The first unit opened to reveal neatly stacked boxes and furniture. The bidding started at $25 and quickly escalated to $300. I stayed quiet, watching, learning. The second unit was clearly trash. Water-damaged boxes, moldy clothes, broken furniture. Still went for $75. Then came Unit 47C. When Bill cut the lock and rolled up the door, I saw what everyone else saw. Boxes covered with tarps, old furniture. The corner of what looked like a broken mirror. It smelled musty, abandoned. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this fine collection of stuff?" $10, someone called out. 20, 25. The bidding stalled at $45. My heart was pounding. Something about the unit called to me. Maybe it was the desperation. Maybe it was intuition, but I raised my hand. 50, Bill pointed at me. $50 from the gentleman in the blue shirt. Do I hear 60? Silence. Going once and going twice, I'm sold to blue shirt for $50. As I walked toward Bill to pay, my hands were shaking. $50 was supposed to last me 3 days for food. But there was no turning back now. After paying and getting the key, I approached Unit 47C. Up close, the reality hit me. Water stains on several boxes, the musty smell stronger than before. What had I done? But I was committed now. I'd borrowed Eddie's pickup truck and had 48 hours to clear everything out and hopefully find something, anything, worth selling. As I pulled away the first top, revealing a stack of water-damaged photo albums, I wondered if this was how my story would end. Broke, homeless, and surrounded by someone else's forgotten memories in a Phoenix storage unit. Little did I know, my real story was just beginning. The Phoenix sun was already brutal at 8 a.m. as I returned to Unit 47C with Eddie's truck and a thermos of coffee. possibly my last good meal for a while. I'd spent the previous evening researching storage unit contents online, trying to maintain some optimism about my $50 gamble. "Okay, Marcus," I said to myself, pulling on work gloves. "Let's see what we've got." I started with the obvious items near the front. The water-damaged photo albums were a total loss. Family pictures from the 1980s and 90s, now stuck together and moldy. A broken mirror, some ceramic dishes with chips, clothes that smelled like they'd been underwater. 30 minutes in, I was questioning every life decision that led me here, but construction work had taught me to be methodical. I loaded the obvious junk into one pile and anything potentially valuable into another. The valuable pile was embarrassingly small, a toolbox with some decent screwdrivers and wrenches, maybe worth $20. Then I reached the back corner, where larger items were covered by a heavy canvas tarp. As I pulled it away, I found an old wooden desk, solid oak by the looks of it. The drawers were swollen shut from moisture, but the wood was quality. Maybe I could get $50 for it, breaking even on my investment. Using a screwdriver from the toolbox, I worked on the stuck drawers. The first one finally gave way with a screech of swollen wood. Inside, rubber bands, paper clips, old pens. The second drawer, more of the same. The third drawer was different. It was deeper than the others, and when I finally got it open, I found it contained a manila envelope wedged against the back. Inside the envelope were documents. At first glance, they looked like old insurance papers, legal documents, the kind of stuff people keep just in case but never actually need. I was about to toss them when something caught my eye. One document had a letterhead I recognized, Pinnacle Investments LLC. I'd seen their billboards around Phoenix. But this wasn't promotional material. It was a stock certificate, issued to Robert Chen for 500 shares of something called TechFlow Solutions. I'd never owned stock in my life, but I knew enough to recognize this was either worthless paper or potentially valuable. The date on the certificate was from 2019. I kept digging through the documents. More stock certificates for the same company, issued to the same Robert Chen. In total, I counted certificates for 2,000 shares of TechFlow Solutions. My phone had terrible signal in the storage facility, so I walked outside and Googled TechFlow Solutions stock price. The results made my hands shake. TechFlow Solutions had been a small Phoenix-based tech company that developed water purification systems. In 2019, they'd been struggling. But in 2021, they'd been acquired by a major corporation for a massive premium. According to the financial news articles I was reading, anyone who held stock during the acquisition would have received a buyout payment. The current articles were 2 years old, but they mentioned a buyout price of $847 per share. I did the math 3 times, convinced I was making an error. 2,000 shares x 847, $1,694,000. Nearly $1.7 million, but there had to be a catch. Stock certificates could be worthless paper if they weren't properly registered, if the buyout had already been claimed, if Robert Chen had sold them years ago. I needed expert help, and I needed it fast. I drove straight to the Phoenix Public Library, my mind racing. If these certificates were legitimate and unclaimed, they could change everything, but I couldn't get my hopes up. Life had taught me that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. The library's business section had resources for stock research. I spent 3 hours learning everything I could about TechFlow Solutions, stock transfers, and acquisition buyouts. The more I read, the more legitimate it seemed, but also the more complicated. The acquisition had been completed in 2021, but unclaimed funds were held in escrow for shareholders who hadn't responded to the buyout notices. There was a process to claim these funds, but it required proving ownership of the shares and the original shareholder's identity. That's when it hit me. I needed to find Robert Chen. Back at the storage unit, I searched through every remaining document, looking for any clue about who Robert Chen was and why his valuable stock certificates had been abandoned in a storage unit. In a box of personal items, I found a lease agreement. The storage unit had been rented by Robert Chen with an address in Tempe, Arizona. The lease showed he'd been paying monthly until March of this year, just 5 months ago. I also found a hospital bracelet with Robert's name and a phone number listed as an emergency contact. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number from the library parking lot. "Hello?" A woman's voice, elderly, cautious. "Hi, I'm trying to reach someone who might know Robert Chen. I found some of his belongings and I'd like to return them." There was a long pause. Robert was my son. He passed away 4 months ago. Cancer. Who is this? My heart sank. I'm very sorry for your loss, ma'am. My name is Marcus Thompson. I bought a storage unit at auction, and it contained some of Robert's belongings. There are some documents that might be important to his estate. Another pause. I'm Margaret Chen, Robert's mother. He didn't have much when he died. The hospital bills, we lost everything. I couldn't even afford to keep paying for his storage unit. Mrs. Chen, I think there might be something in these documents that could help you. Would it be possible for us to meet? That evening, I sat in a Denny's restaurant in Tempe across from Margaret Chen, a small, dignified woman in her 70s. Her eyes were red-rimmed with the exhaustion of grief and financial stress. I'd brought copies of the stock certificates, not wanting to get her hopes up until we knew more. Robert was always involved in investments, she said, studying the documents. Even when he was sick, he kept talking about this company, TechFlow. He said it was going to be big someday, but then he got sicker and we focused on treatment. Mrs. Chen, I need to be honest with you. These certificates might be worth a significant amount of money, but they belong to Robert's estate, which means they belong to you. Her hands trembled as she looked at the papers. How much money? If they're legitimate and the claims process works out, possibly over $1 million. Margaret Chen stared at me for a long moment, then began to cry. Not tears of joy, but the overwhelming tears of someone who had been carrying an impossible weight. I've been living on Social Security, she whispered. I had to sell Robert's car, his furniture, everything, just to pay the medical bills he left behind. I've been wondering how I'm going to survive. As I drove home that night, the weight of what I'd discovered was crushing. I'd spent $50 hoping to make enough money to pay rent. Instead, I'd found what might be a life-changing fortune, but it belonged to a grieving mother who needed it far more than I did. The ethical choice was clear, but that didn't make it easy. I was still facing homelessness, still had medical bills of my own, still had no source of income. But sometimes doing the right thing is the only choice that lets you sleep at night. The next morning, I met Margaret Chen at a downtown Phoenix law office. I'd spent my last $60 to consult with an attorney who specialized in estate law and securities. Margaret insisted on paying me back, but I refused. This was my investment in doing the right thing. Attorney Sarah Martinez was a sharp woman in her 40s who'd agreed to take the case on contingency after I explained the situation. This is unusual, she said, reviewing the certificates. Stock certificates from a company that was acquired 2 years ago, found in an abandoned storage unit. We need to verify several things: the authenticity of the certificates, whether they were properly registered, and the status of Robert Chen's estate. Margaret had brought Robert's death certificate and other estate documents. Robert never married, and I'm his only heir, she explained. But the medical bills, I had to declare bankruptcy 6 months ago. Sarah nodded. Bankruptcy doesn't affect assets that weren't disclosed or weren't known at the time. If these certificates were overlooked, they could still belong to the estate. The first step was verifying the certificates with the transfer agent who had handled TechFlow's acquisition. Sarah made the call while Margaret and I waited anxiously. Yes, I'm calling about unclaimed acquisition proceeds for TechFlow Solutions. Certificate numbers. Sarah read off the numbers from Robert's certificates. I see. And the shareholder of record is Robert Chen. Yes, we can provide death certificate and estate documentation. She hung up and turned to us with a measured expression. The certificates are legitimate. The shares were never transferred or sold, and the acquisition proceeds are being held in escrow. The total amount, including interest, is $1,847,000. Margaret gasped and grabbed my hand. Marcus, I can't believe this. After everything we've been through. But Sarah held up a cautionary hand. There's a complication. The escrow account has a deadline. If the funds aren't claimed within 30 days, which is 18 days from now, they revert to the acquiring company. It's standard language in acquisition agreements. 18 days to process an estate claim, I asked. It's tight, but possible. We'll need to move fast. Margaret, I'll need you to petition the probate court to be appointed as administrator of Robert's estate. Then we can file the claim. Over the next week, I found myself deeply involved in a process I'd never imagined. Margaret needed help navigating the legal paperwork, and since I'd found the certificates, Sarah said my testimony might be crucial in establishing their provenance. I spent my days helping Margaret gather documents and my evenings researching everything I could about TechFlow Solutions and the acquisition process. My own financial crisis was temporarily forgotten. I was living on ramen noodles and the occasional meal Margaret insisted on buying me. You know, Margaret said one afternoon as we sat in another lawyer's office, Robert would have liked you. He always said the measure of a person wasn't how much they had, but what they did when they had the choice to help someone else. The investigation revealed more about Robert Chen's story. He'd been a software engineer who'd invested his life savings in TechFlow when the company was struggling. His belief in their water purification technology had been vindicated when the company developed a breakthrough system that caught the attention of a major corporation. But Robert had been diagnosed with cancer just months before the acquisition was announced. The legal notices about the buyout had been sent to his apartment, but he'd been in and out of hospitals. Margaret had been focused on his care, not his investments. He mentioned the stock certificates once, Margaret remembered. Said they were in his important papers. But during the final months we were just trying to spend time together. I wasn't thinking about finances. As the deadline approached, we hit a bureaucratic wall. The probate court was backlogged, and Margaret's petition to be appointed estate administrator was stuck in processing. "We need to push harder," Sarah said during an emergency meeting. "I've been in contact with the escrow company. They're willing to accept our documentation, but they need proof that Margaret is legally authorized to act on behalf of the estate." "What about the person who originally found the certificates?" asked the escrow company representative during a conference call. "Do we have verification of how these came to light?" That's when I realized my role in this story was more important than I'd thought. So I wasn't just a good Samaritan helping a grieving mother. I was a key witness whose testimony could validate the entire claim. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said after the call, "I need you to prepare a detailed affidavit about exactly how you found these certificates. Every detail matters. The storage auction, the condition of the unit, the discovery of the documents, all of it." I spent an entire day writing and rewriting my statement, making sure every detail was accurate. The storage facility manager provided records showing the unit had been abandoned when Robert stopped paying rent. The auction house confirmed the sale to me for $50. But with 8 days left until the deadline, we were still waiting for the probate court. That's when Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone. "Marcus," she said, sitting across from me in the same Denny's where we'd first discussed the certificates, "I want you to know something. When this money comes through, and Sarah says she's confident it will, I'm giving you half." "Margaret, no, I can't accept that. This is your son's money. Robert left me this money, but you found it. Without you, it would have been worthless paper in a landfill. Besides," she smiled through tears, "Robert always said money was meant to help people. What better way to honor his memory than by helping the person who helped us?" I started to protest, but she held up her hand. "I'm 73 years old, Marcus. I don't need almost $2 million. I need enough to live comfortably and maybe help my church with their community programs. You're 34 with your whole life ahead of you. You have medical bills. You're facing homelessness. Robert would want his money to help someone who would use it to build a better life." That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of my back pain or financial anxiety, but because I was overwhelmed by the generosity of a woman who had every reason to be bitter about life, but chose kindness instead. With 6 days left until the deadline, Sarah called with news. "The probate court approved Margaret's petition. We're officially the estate administrators. I'm filing the claim with the escrow company first thing tomorrow morning." As I hung up the phone, I realized this experience had already changed me in ways that had nothing to do with money. I'd learned about integrity, about the connections we make with strangers who become family, and about how sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't things you can put a price on. But the biggest test was still ahead. The claim was filed on a Tuesday morning with 4 days to spare before the deadline. Sarah had submitted every document twice, included every piece of supporting evidence, and made follow-up calls to ensure everything was received properly. Now came the hardest part: waiting. "The escrow company has 72 hours to review and approve the claim," Sarah explained during our meeting that afternoon. "If they have questions or need additional documentation, we'll have to respond immediately." Margaret and I spent those 3 days in a strange limbo. She insisted I stay at her small apartment in Tempe rather than drive back and forth from Phoenix. "It doesn't make sense for you to waste gas money when we're both just waiting by the phone," she said. Robert's childhood bedroom had been converted into a small office, and that's where I slept on an air mattress. The walls were covered with photos of Robert from elementary school through his college graduation from Arizona State University. Margaret would sometimes find me looking at them. "He was so proud of that engineering degree," she said one evening, standing in the doorway. "First person in our family to graduate college. His father died when Robert was 16, So it was just the two of us. I worked 2 jobs to help pay for his education. He sounds like he was a good man. He was. That's why I know he'd approve of what we're doing. Robert always said success wasn't about how much you accumulated, but about how much you shared. On the second day of waiting, Sarah called with an update. The escrow company has started their review process. They've verified the certificate numbers and confirmed the acquisition proceeds are available. But they want to conduct a phone interview with you, Marcus, to verify your testimony about finding the documents. My heart rate spiked. What kind of interview? Nothing complicated. They just need to confirm your story matches the written affidavit. It's standard due diligence for large claims. The interview was scheduled for the next morning, the final day before the deadline. That night, Margaret and I sat in her small living room, both too anxious to watch television. "Marcus, I need to ask you something," she said during a commercial break. "If this doesn't work out, if they reject the claim, are you going to be okay?" I'd been trying not to think about that possibility. If the certificates proved worthless, I'd spent the last 2 weeks helping someone else instead of solving my own problems. My rent was now 3 weeks overdue, and my landlord had started calling daily. "I'll figure something out," I said. "I always do, but you've given up so much time. Margaret, meeting you and learning about Robert has been worth more than money. I mean that." She smiled, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew that doing the right thing didn't pay rent. The next morning I sat in Sarah's conference room for the phone interview with the escrow company representative. Margaret and Sarah listened on speaker. "Mr. Thompson, can you walk us through exactly how you came to possess these stock certificates?" I told the entire story. The injury, the financial desperation, Eddie's advice about storage auctions, the $50 bid, the systematic search through the unit, and the discovery of the envelope in the desk drawer. "And you're certain these documents were in the storage unit when you purchased it?" "Absolutely certain. I have receipts from the auction house, records from the storage facility, and witness statements from the auctioneer." "Why did you decide to track down the rightful owner rather than attempt to claim the certificates yourself?" That question caught me off guard. "Because they weren't mine. Just because I found them didn't give me the right to claim them. They belonged to Robert Chen's estate, which meant they belonged to his mother." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Thompson, I have to tell you, most people in your situation would have tried to claim these certificates as abandoned property." "Most people probably aren't facing homelessness," I replied. "But even if I was desperate enough to consider it, I couldn't live with myself knowing I'd stolen from a grieving mother." After 30 more minutes of questions, the representative thanked us and said they'd have a decision within 6 hours. Those 6 hours felt like 6 days. Margaret made lunch, but neither of us could eat. Sarah called twice to check in. Eddie stopped by to see how I was doing. "Hermano, whatever happens, you did the right thing," Eddie said. "That has to count for something." At 4:47 p.m., Sarah's phone rang. "This is Sarah Martinez." "Yes, I'm here with Mrs. Chen and Mr. Thompson." "I see. Are you certain? That's wonderful news. Thank you so much." She hung up and looked at us with a huge smile. "The claim has been approved. The escrow company is releasing $1,347,000 to Robert Chen's estate, payable to Margaret as the estate administrator." Margaret started crying immediately. I felt my knees go weak with relief and disbelief. "The funds will be wire transferred within 48 hours, Sarah continued. "After legal fees and estate processing costs, Margaret, you're looking at approximately $1.75 million. That evening, we celebrated at a nice restaurant in Scottsdale, the first expensive meal I'd had in months. Margaret insisted on ordering champagne, even though none of us were big drinkers. "To Robert," she said, raising her glass, "and to Marcus, who proved that honest people still exist in this world." As we clinked glasses, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just because of the money Margaret had promised to share, but because I'd learned something about myself. Even when facing my worst financial crisis, I'd chosen integrity over self-interest. "So, what's next?" Margaret asked as we shared dessert. "Next, you get to build the life Robert would have wanted for you," I said, "and maybe help some other people along the way." But I was also thinking about my own future. Margaret's generosity would solve my immediate problems, but this experience had given me something more valuable, a new perspective on what really mattered. The kid who'd grown up poor in Phoenix, dropped out of high school to work construction, and thought his best days were behind him, had just learned that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They have to be earned through the choices we make when nobody's watching. The money would change both our lives, but the experience had already changed who we were. 2 weeks later, I stood in the lobby of a downtown Phoenix bank holding a cashier's check for $875,000. Margaret had insisted on the 50-50 split despite my protests, and Sarah had handled all the legal paperwork to ensure the transfer was properly documented. "This feels surreal," I said to Margaret as we walked out of the bank together. "Robert would be so happy," she replied, clutching her own check. "He always said money was just a tool to build something better." My first stop was my landlord's office to pay my back rent and give notice. Mrs. Patterson, the property manager, who'd been calling me daily for weeks, looked shocked when I walked in with cash. "Mr. Thompson, I was just about to start eviction proceedings." "I know, and I'm sorry about the delay. Here's the back rent, plus late fees, plus 2 months' notice." I handed her an envelope with $3,600 in cash. "I'll be moving out at the end of the month." Next, I drove to the medical center to pay off my outstanding bills from the back injury. The billing department looked equally surprised when I requested to pay the full balance in cash. "Sir, you can set up a payment plan if the full amount is too much." "No payment plan necessary," I said, writing a check for $8,400. "I'd like to pay it in full today." That afternoon, I met Eddie at his apartment to return his truck and tell him what had happened. His jaw dropped as I explained the entire story. "Dios mío, Marcus. You found almost $2 million and gave half of it away?" "She gave half to me, Eddie. Those certificates belong to Robert's estate. I just found them." "But still, hermano, most people would have tried to keep it all, I know. That's what everyone keeps saying. But I couldn't live with myself if I'd done that." Eddie shook his head, grinning. "You're either the most honest man in Arizona or the craziest. Maybe both." Over the next few weeks, I started making plans for my new life. But first, I wanted to understand how I'd gotten to the point where $50 had seemed like such a huge risk. I met with a financial advisor who specialized in helping working-class people manage sudden wealth. Tom Rodriguez had grown up in similar circumstances and understood the psychology of financial insecurity. "Marcus, the first thing you need to understand is that this money gives you choices you've never had before," Tom said during our first meeting. "But it also comes with responsibility. How do you want this to change your life?" I'd been thinking about that question constantly. I don't want to just stop working and live off the money. I want to build something that matters. What does that look like to you? I've been in construction my whole adult life. I know the industry, I understand the work, and I've seen how much need there is for affordable housing in Phoenix. Maybe I could start a construction company that focuses on building homes for working families. Tom nodded approvingly. "That's a solid plan. You'd be using your existing skills and knowledge to create something meaningful. Have you thought about the business structure?" Over the following months, I threw myself into learning everything I could about running a construction business. I took courses at the local community college on business management, accounting, and entrepreneurship. I studied successful contractors who specialized in affordable housing. Margaret, meanwhile, was pursuing her own dreams. She donated $200,000 to her church for their community outreach programs and was working with local charities to establish a scholarship fund in Robert's name for engineering students. "I never thought I'd be in a position to help so many people," she told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. Robert would be amazed. She'd also moved to a nice retirement community in Scottsdale, where she'd quickly become involved in various volunteer activities. "I have more energy now that I'm not worried about money," she said. "It's like a weight has been lifted." 6 months after finding the certificates, I officially launched Thompson Construction LLC, with a focus on building affordable starter homes in Phoenix's growing suburbs. My first project was a development of 12 modest homes priced for teachers, firefighters, and other essential workers who couldn't afford the luxury developments spreading across the city. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was building exactly the kind of homes I'd never been able to afford myself. My first hire was Eddie Ramirez, who'd been struggling to find steady work after his previous contractor closed down. "You sure about this, Marcus? Going from employee to boss is a big change." "I'm sure. But Eddie, I want to run this differently than most construction companies. Fair wages, good benefits, and we treat everyone with respect." "Think you can handle being my foreman?" "Hermano, I'd follow you into a hurricane if you asked." The business grew steadily. Word spread that Thompson Construction delivered quality work at fair prices and treated both customers and employees well. By the end of the first year, we had 23 employees and a 6-month backlog of projects. But success brought new challenges. I found myself working longer hours than I had as a regular construction worker, dealing with permits, suppliers, financing, and all the complexities of running a business. During particularly stressful days, I'd remember sitting in that storage unit, wondering if $50 would make any difference in my life. The answer had been yes, but not in any way I could have imagined. One evening, as I was reviewing project plans in my new office, Margaret called with unexpected news. "Marcus, I've been thinking about Robert's story and yours, and I want to do something special. What would you think about writing a book about this whole experience?" "A book?" "Margaret, I'm not a writer, but you're a storyteller. Every time you tell someone about finding those certificates, they're captivated, and I think people need to hear about what you did, choosing integrity over personal gain. It's a message the world needs right now." That conversation planted a seed that would eventually grow into something I'd never expected. A second career as a speaker and author, sharing the story of how a $50 gamble led to discoveries worth more than money. But that night, I was still just a construction worker who'd gotten lucky and tried to do the right thing with his luck. As I locked up the office and headed home to the modest house I'd finally been able to buy, I thought about Robert Chen, a man I'd never met, but who had profoundly impacted my life. His investment in a struggling tech company had created wealth, but his mother's wisdom about sharing that wealth had created something even more valuable, a reminder that our choices define us more than our circumstances. The storage unit that had seemed like my last desperate attempt to avoid homelessness had actually been the first step toward building the life I'd always wanted but never thought I could achieve. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that help us discover who we really are. 2 years after that life-changing storage auction, I stood in front of 300 people at the Phoenix Convention Center, delivering a keynote speech about integrity and unexpected opportunities. The book Margaret had encouraged me to write, $50 and a Storage Unit, A Story of Integrity and Unexpected Wealth, had become a regional bestseller and led to speaking engagements across Arizona. The question I get asked most often, I told the audience, is whether I ever regret giving Margaret half of that money. The answer is no, not for a single second, because keeping money that didn't belong to me would have made me rich, but sharing it made me wealthy in ways I'm still discovering. In the front row sat Margaret, now 75, and one of my biggest supporters. Next to her was Eddie, who'd become not just my business partner, but one of my closest friends. Thompson Construction had grown to 62 employees, and we'd built over 200 homes for working families in the Phoenix area. But success had brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. 3 months earlier, I'd received a call that changed everything again. A man named David Chen, Robert's cousin from California, had contacted Sarah Martinez, claiming that Robert had promised him the TechFlow stock certificates years ago, before his illness. "He's filed a lawsuit challenging the estate distribution," Sarah had explained during an emergency meeting. "He claims he has documentation showing Robert intended to leave the stocks to him, not to Margaret." The lawsuit threatened not only Margaret's financial security, but potentially my own. If David Chen could prove his claim, he might be able to recover the money from both of us, even though we'd acted in good faith. "How strong is his case?" I'd asked. "Hard to say. He has some emails between him and Robert discussing the stock investment, but nothing that definitively shows Robert promised him the certificates. Still, estate disputes can be unpredictable. The legal battle consumed most of the past year. David Chen hired an aggressive attorney who portrayed Margaret and me as opportunists who'd taken advantage of a confused, dying man's oversight. The stress nearly broke Margaret's health, and the legal fees were mounting for both of us. "Marcus," Margaret had said during one particularly difficult deposition, "maybe we should just settle. Give him half and end this nightmare." "Absolutely not," I'd replied. "Robert left those stocks to you. His cousin is trying to profit from a family tragedy." The case finally went to trial 6 weeks ago. David Chen's attorney argued that Robert had been too ill to properly manage his affairs, and that the storage unit abandonment proved he'd intended someone else to handle his investments. Our attorney countered with evidence of Robert's mental competency until his final weeks and testimony, showing he'd specifically told Margaret about important papers in his storage unit. The turning point came when Sarah discovered something David Chen's attorney had overlooked. Robert's medical records showed he'd been lucid and making financial decisions until just days before his death. He'd even made a small charitable donation the week before he passed away. Judge Patricia Morrison ruled in our favor, stating that Mr. David Chen has failed to provide compelling evidence that the decedent intended to alter his estate plan, and the court finds no reason to overturn the lawful distribution of assets to the legal heir. Now, 2 months later, the ordeal was finally behind us, but it had taught me something important about the responsibilities that come with unexpected wealth. After my speech, Margaret and I sat in the hotel restaurant reflecting on the journey. "You know what I learned from that lawsuit?" she said, stirring her coffee. "Money doesn't just change your life. It changes how other people see you." David hadn't spoken to Robert in 5 years, but suddenly he was very concerned about family inheritance. Do you think Robert would have wanted his cousin to have the money? Absolutely not. Robert specifically chose not to include David in his will after David asked him for a loan to cover gambling debts. Robert told me, "Family is important, but enabling bad decisions isn't love." The legal victory had been satisfying, but the process had drained both of us emotionally and financially. Legal fees had cost me nearly $150,000, and Margaret had spent even more. "Sometimes I wonder if we should have just given David half the money to avoid the fight," Margaret said. "No," I said firmly, "because that would have sent the message that you can bully people into giving up what's rightfully theirs. Robert earned that money through his investment and his belief in tech flow. You inherited it legally. David was trying to profit from a lie." That evening I drove through the neighborhoods where Thompson Construction had built homes. Families were grilling dinner in backyards, children were playing in driveways, and porch lights were coming on as the Arizona sun set. These were the homes Robert's investment had made possible, not just because his stock certificates provided the capital, but because his mother's wisdom about sharing wealth had inspired me to build something meaningful. I pulled over at one house where I recognized the owner, Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who worked as a nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital. I'd built her house 18 months ago, and she was in her front yard planting flowers. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, waving. "Perfect timing. I wanted to thank you again. Anna just got accepted to Arizona State University with a partial scholarship." Anna was Maria's 17-year-old daughter, who I'd met during the construction process. Smart kid with big dreams of becoming an engineer. "That's fantastic, Maria. You must be so proud." "I am. And Marcus, I need you to know, having this house, having stability, it made all the difference for Anna. She could focus on school instead of worrying about whether we'd have to move again." As I drove home, Maria's words reminded me why the storage unit discovery had been about more than money. It had been about the ripple effects of one person's choices, creating opportunities for others. That night, I called Margaret to share Maria's news. "Anna wants to study engineering, just like Robert," I told her. "Robert would love that," Margaret said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You know, Marcus, I've been thinking about establishing more scholarships. There must be other kids like Anna who just need a chance." "I've been thinking the same thing. What if Thompson Construction partnered with your foundation to create apprenticeships for kids who want to learn construction trades, good-paying jobs that don't require college debt?" "I love that idea. Let's talk about it tomorrow." As I hung up the phone, I realized the storage unit discovery had taught me the most important lesson of my life. Wealth isn't about what you accumulate, it's about what you create with the resources you're given. Robert Chen's $50 storage unit had contained nearly $2 million in stock certificates, but the real treasure had been the reminder that our choices about integrity, generosity, and responsibility define not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone we touch. I'd gone to that auction hoping to find something valuable enough to pay rent. Instead, I'd found something far more valuable, the discovery of who I really was when faced with a choice between easy money and doing the right thing. Sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought, sold, or stored in a storage unit. They can only be earned through the decisions we make when nobody's watching and the character we show when everything is on the line. The $50 I'd spent that desperate morning had been the best investment of my life. Not because of the financial return, but because of the person it helped me become. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I thought about Robert Chen, a man I'd never met but who had changed my life forever. His investment in a struggling tech company had created wealth, but his family's wisdom about sharing that wealth had created something even more valuable, a legacy of integrity that would continue long after the money was spent. Tomorrow, I'd go back to building homes for working families. Next week, Margaret and I would announce our new scholarship and apprenticeship programs. And someday I'd tell this story to my own children about the day their father bought junk for $50 and found a fortune, but more importantly, found himself. The storage unit had been emptied and cleaned years ago, but the lessons it contained would last a lifetime. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as I walked through what would soon become Sunrise Gardens, our largest affordable housing development yet. 53 homes for working families, each one designed with the same care and attention to detail that I'd want in my own house. "Morning, boss," called out Jake Martinez, one of our newest apprentices. At 19, he reminded me of myself at that age, eager to work, hungry to learn, and grateful for the opportunity. The difference was that Jake was part of our scholarship program, earning his construction certification while building real homes for real families. "How's the foundation work coming along?" I asked, reviewing the progress on the house that would soon belong to the Rodriguez family, a teacher and a firefighter with 2 young children. "Right on schedule. Should be ready for the concrete pour tomorrow." 5 years had passed since that desperate morning when I'd spent my last $50 on storage unit 47C. 5 years since I'd discovered that doing the right thing could change not just one life, but dozens of lives in ways I'd never imagined. Thompson Construction now employed 127 people across 3 divisions: affordable housing, commercial projects, and our newest venture, disaster relief construction. We'd built over 400 homes, renovated 6 schools, and constructed 2 community centers. But the numbers didn't tell the real story. The real story was in the families who'd found stability, the young people who'd discovered careers they'd never considered, and the community connections that had grown from one act of integrity. Later that morning, I drove to the Robert Chen Memorial Scholarship Foundation headquarters, a converted office building in downtown Phoenix that Margaret had purchased and renovated. At 77, she moved with the energy of someone half her age, fueled by purpose and the joy of giving. "Marcus," she called out as I entered the main office. "Perfect timing, I want to show you something." She led me to a wall covered with photos and thank you letters. "These are our scholarship recipients from this year. 43 students studying engineering, computer science, and skilled trades. And look at this." She pointed to a photo of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown. "Ana Gonzalez. Remember her? The nurse's daughter whose house you built? She graduated last month with a degree in environmental engineering. Her senior project was designing a water purification system for rural communities." I smiled, remembering the shy 17-year-old I'd met during construction of her mother's house. Robert would be proud. He would. But Marcus, there's something else. Anna wants to work for TechFlow Solutions, the same company Robert invested in. They're expanding their water purification work into developing countries, and they offered her a position on their international team. The connection gave me chills. Robert's investment had created wealth, which had funded Anna's education, which was now leading her to continue his belief in clean water technology. It was like the universe had orchestrated the entire sequence of events. "How many young people have we helped now?" I asked. 215 through the scholarship program and another 98 through your apprenticeship initiative. But it's not just the numbers, Marcus. Yesterday, I got a call from Miguel Santos. Remember him? One of your first apprentices? He just started his own small construction company, specializing in home repairs for elderly residents. He's hiring 3 more young people. This was what Margaret called the ripple effect, how one act of generosity created expanding circles of positive impact. The money Robert had earned through his TechFlow investment wasn't just changing individual lives, it was building a network of people committed to helping others. That afternoon brought a surprise that would add another chapter to our story. My assistant, Patricia, knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't read. "Marcus, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about the storage unit." My heart skipped. After 5 years, I'd assumed that chapter was completely closed. I walked to the lobby to find a woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Linda Chen. I was Robert's sister. I live in Seattle and I just learned about what you did for my mother." I invited her into my office, wondering what this unexpected visit might mean. "I need to apologize," Linda said, settling into a chair. "When Robert died, I was dealing with my own family crisis. My husband had lost his job and we were struggling to keep our house. Mother told me about the medical bills and the bankruptcy, but I couldn't help financially. I'm ashamed to say I lost touch with her during that difficult time. Margaret never mentioned having other children, because I wasn't there when she needed me most. I've been carrying that guilt for years. But last month my daughter was researching family genealogy for a school project, and she found newspaper articles about the TechFlow settlement. That's how I learned what really happened." Linda reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Mr. Thompson, I've been successful in my real estate career in Seattle. I'm not wealthy, but I'm comfortable, and I want to contribute to what Mother and you have built here." She handed me a check for $100,000 made out to the Robert Chen Memorial Foundation. "This doesn't make up for not being there," she continued, "but I hope it can help continue Robert's legacy. And Mr. Thompson, thank you. Thank you for being the kind of person my brother believed existed in the world." After Linda left, I sat in my office holding her check and thinking about the unexpected ways life comes full circle. Her contribution would fund 20 more scholarships, but more importantly, it represented healing for a family that had been fractured by tragedy and economic hardship.